The phone rang at 2 in the morning, and Damian Volkov knew before he answered that something was wrong. No one called him at this hour unless the news was bad. Good news could always wait until sunrise. Bad news never did. He was still awake, sitting behind his desk with a glass of untouched whiskey beside a stack of papers he had stopped reading an hour ago. The city outside his window was dark and quiet, but the silence in his chest was louder than any noise the streets could make. When his phone buzzed against the wood, he looked at the name on the screen and felt his stomach drop. It was Marco, his most trusted man. Marco never called this late unless something had gone badly wrong. Damian picked up on the second ring. "Talk." "Boss, it's about Elena." Marco's voice was tight, clipped, the way it always sounded when he was trying to stay calm. "There are men outside her building. 3 of them. They've been circling the block for 20 minutes. I think they're waiting for something." Damian was already standing before Marco finished the sentence. He grabbed his coat from the back of his chair, his mind moving faster than his body. Elena Marchetti, his secretary, the woman who organized his calendar, filtered his calls, and kept the chaos of his business from swallowing him whole. She was supposed to be safe. She was supposed to be far from all of this. "Send me the address," Damian said, though he already knew it. He had memorized it months ago, back when he first started noticing the quiet efficiency of the woman who worked 2 doors down from his office, the one who never asked questions she didn't need to ask, and never repeated a word she overheard. "Boss, I can send men. I'm going myself." Damian was already moving through the hallway of his penthouse, his footsteps sharp against the marble floor. "Get 2 cars ready, now." He did not wait for Marco's reply. He ended the call and shoved the phone into his pocket, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. Damian Volkov did not panic. He had built an empire on the ability to stay calm when other men fell apart, on making decisions with a clear head while blood was still wet on the ground. But something about hearing Elena's name paired with danger made his hands shake as he pressed the elevator button, again and again, as if that would make it arrive faster. Down in the garage, 2 black cars waited with their engines already running. Marco stood beside the first one, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. "Boss, are you sure you want to do this yourself? If it's a trap." "If it's a trap, then whoever said it made the mistake of using Elena as bait." Damian's voice was low and even, but there was something underneath it, something sharp and dangerous. "Get in the car." The drive across the city took 11 minutes, though it felt like an hour. Damian sat in the back seat, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the streetlights blurring past the window. He thought about the last time he had seen Elena, just hours earlier, when she had stayed late to finish organizing files for a meeting the next morning. She had smiled at him on her way out, a small, polite smile, the kind she always gave him, and said goodnight in that soft voice of hers. He had barely looked up from his papers to respond. He thought about that now, how he had barely looked at her, how he had let months pass without truly seeing the woman who kept his entire operation running smoothly behind the scenes. Elena was not like the people who usually surrounded him. She did not flatter him. She did not fear him the way most people did. She simply did her job with a quiet precision that he had come to rely on more than he ever admitted. There had been 100 small moments over the past year that Damian only now allowed himself to remember. The way Elena stayed an extra hour without complaint whenever a deal fell apart and needed damage control. The way she always had coffee ready before he asked for it, not because she was trying to impress him, but because she paid attention in a way most people around him never bothered to. Other women who had worked in his office over the years had tried too hard, had laughed too loudly at things that were not funny, had lingered too long near his desk. Elena had never done any of that. She kept a respectful distance, did excellent work, and went home. It was that very lack of pretense that had made her invisible to him for so long, and it was that same quality that now made his chest tighten with worry. He wondered, not for the first time, why a woman as sharp and composed as Elena had never once asked him for anything. No favors, no special treatment, Nothing beyond her paycheck and the occasional day off. In his world, everyone wanted something. Everyone had an angle. Elena's lack of an angle had always struck him as strange, and now, sitting in the back of a car racing toward her apartment, he wondered if her quiet nature had made her an easy target for someone with far worse intentions than his own. And now she might be in danger because of him. The car turned onto her street, and Damien's eyes immediately found the two vehicles parked across from her apartment building. Engines off, headlights dark. Even from a distance, he could see shapes moving inside them, men waiting, watching, his hands curled into fists. "Stop here," he told the driver. "Don't get any closer yet." Marco leaned forward from the front seat. "Boss, what's the play?" Damien studied the building. Elena lived on the third floor, in a modest apartment with a single window that faced the street. The light in that window was off, which meant either she was asleep, unaware of the danger outside, or she already knew something was wrong and was trying not to draw attention to herself. Just then, his phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. 2 words. "She knows." Damien's blood ran cold. He didn't know who had sent it, but the meaning was clear enough. Someone believed Elena had learned something she wasn't supposed to know, something dangerous enough to justify watching her apartment in the middle of the night. He thought back over the past few days, searching his memory for anything Elena might have seen or heard. And then it hit him. 2 nights ago, she had stayed late again, organizing files in the office next to his while he took a call in his own room, a call he thought was private. A call about a shipment that had gone missing, and the man inside his organization he suspected was responsible. Had she heard him? Had she pieced together what he had only begun to suspect himself, that someone close to him, someone he trusted, was working against him? The shipment in question had been worth more than money. It carried information, records that could unravel years of careful arrangements if they ended up in the wrong hands. Only a handful of people had known about its route, and Damien had spent the last 2 days quietly watching each of them, searching for a flicker of guilt, a slip in behavior, anything that might point to the traitor among them. He had found nothing. Whoever it was had covered their tracks well, better than Damien expected from anyone inside his circle. And now, it seemed, that same person believed a secretary with no real power and no real reason to care had somehow become a liability worth eliminating. That thought alone was enough to make Damien's hands curl into fists again. Marco shifted in his seat, glancing between Damien and the parked cars across the street. "Boss, whoever sent that text wants you to know they're watching. That's not a mistake. That's a message." "I know exactly what it is," Damien said quietly. He had built his career reading messages like this one, the kind meant to unsettle a man before a single shot was fired. Someone wanted him distracted, wanted him reacting instead of thinking. The problem for them was that Damien Volkov had never once let fear make his decisions for him, and he was not about to start tonight. "Boss?" Marco's voice pulled him back. "We're just sitting here. If they make a move—" "They won't," Damien said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "Not with us watching." He opened the car door before Marco could argue further and stepped out into the cold night air. Marco followed immediately, along with 2 other men from the second car, all of them falling into position around Damien without needing to be told. It was a formation they had used 100 times before, though never for a reason like this. Damien crossed the street with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving the parked cars. As he approached, one of the doors opened, and a man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially hidden beneath the brim of a dark cap. "You're on the wrong street," Damien said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet night. The man didn't answer right away. He glanced past Damien toward Marco and the others, doing quick math on the odds. And something in his posture shifted, a slight retreat, a recalculation. "We're just passing through," the man finally said. "Then keep passing." Damien's tone left no room for argument. This street doesn't need visitors tonight. For a long moment, nobody moved. Damien could feel the tension stretching thin, the possibility of violence hanging in the air like static before a storm. Then, without another word, the man climbed back into the car, and both vehicles pulled away from the curb, disappearing around the corner and out of sight. Damien didn't relax until the sound of their engines faded completely. "Boss," Marco said quietly, "we should get eyes on her, make sure she's okay." Damien was already moving toward the building's entrance. He didn't wait for the buzzer system. One of his men produced a key, one that had clearly been arranged in advance for situations exactly like this one, and they climbed the stairs quickly, quietly, 3 flights up to Elena's door. Damien knocked, softer than he expected himself to, given the urgency pounding through his chest. "Elena, it's Damien." There was a pause, then the sound of movement inside, quick and careful. When the door opened, Elena stood there in a plain sweater, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. She was not a small woman, and she carried herself with a kind of quiet confidence that Damien had always found intriguing, but tonight, that confidence was cracked, replaced by something rawer and more human. "Mr. Volkov?" Her voice trembled slightly. "What are you doing here?" "It's the middle of the night. Are you alone?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the small apartment behind her. "Yes, She stopped, noticing the men behind him, noticing the seriousness on his face. "What's going on? You're scaring me." Damien closed the door behind him and turned to face her fully, taking in every detail, the slight shake in her hands, the way her eyes darted toward the window, as if she had noticed something earlier that night, and dismissed it as nothing. "There were men outside your building," he said, "watching your window. Did you see anything unusual tonight? Hear anything strange?" Elena's face went pale. She sank slowly onto the arm of her couch, her hand pressing against her chest, as if trying to steady her own heartbeat. "I thought I imagined it. There was a car outside earlier, before I got home. I thought it was nothing." It wasn't nothing. Damien knelt slightly, bringing himself closer to her eye level, an instinct he didn't fully understand himself. "Elena, I need you to think carefully. 2 nights ago, when you were working late, did you overhear anything? A phone call, maybe, from my office?" Her eyes flickered with recognition, and then guilt, and Damien knew immediately that his suspicion had been correct. "I didn't mean to hear it," she said quietly. "I was filing papers, and your door wasn't fully closed. I heard you talking about a shipment, about someone inside the company. I didn't think it was my business, so I never said anything." Damien felt something settle in his chest, a mixture of relief that she was safe and dread at what this meant. Someone had found out that Elena might know something, and that someone was willing to send men to her home in the middle of the night to find out how much she knew, or perhaps to silence her before she could tell anyone else. "You're not safe here anymore," Damien said, standing up straight again, his voice hardening with resolve. "Not until we figure out who did this." Elena looked up at him, her fear now mixed with something else, a flicker of defiance that surprised him. "So what happens now? I just leave everything behind because some men decided to sit outside my building?" "You come with me," Damien said simply. "Tonight." "I can't just—" "Elena," he said her name firmly, cutting off her protest, and something in the way he said it made her stop. "Whoever sent those men knows where you live. They know your schedule. They may already know things about you that even I don't. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to trust that I will not let anything happen to you because of something you overheard by accident." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for something, perhaps some sign of the ruthless man she had heard whispered about in the office hallways, the reputation that followed him like a shadow. But all she found was quiet urgency and something that looked almost like guilt, as if he blamed himself for putting her in danger without ever realizing it. Finally, she nodded, standing up and moving toward her bedroom to gather a few things. Damien watched her go, his mind already working through the list of people who could have known about the conversation she overheard, narrowing down the possibilities to the small circle of men he trusted most. If one of them had betrayed him, if one of them was willing to threaten an innocent woman to protect their secret, then Damien would find out exactly who it was. And when he did, there would be no mercy. As Elena returned with a small bag packed, her hands still trembling slightly, Damien felt something shift inside him, a protectiveness he hadn't expected to feel this strongly, not for someone who had simply been part of the background of his daily life until tonight. "Stay close to me," he said, guiding her toward the door with a hand hovering near her back, careful not to touch her, though every instinct told him to keep her as close as possible. "We're leaving now." They walked down the stairs together, flanked by Marco and the others, out into the cold night air where the street sat empty and silent, as if nothing had happened at all. But Damien knew better. Somewhere out there, someone was watching, someone who now understood that Elena Marchetti was no longer just his secretary. She had become a target, and Damien intended to make sure she never became anything else. As they reached the car, Elena paused, looking back up at the building she had called home for the past 3 years, uncertainty flickering across her face. Damien opened the car door for her, waiting patiently despite the urgency still pulsing through his veins. "It's going to be all right," he said quietly, the words feeling strange coming from a man who rarely offered comfort to anyone. Elena looked at him, studying his face in the dim light of the street lamp. "Do you actually believe that, or are you just saying it?" For the first time that night, Damien allowed himself a small, tired smile. "I believe it because I intend to make it true." She climbed into the car without another word, and Damien slid in beside her, the door closing behind them, with a heavy, final sound. As the car pulled away from the curb and into the empty streets, Damien glanced at Elena one more time, noticing the way she held herself together despite everything, refusing to fall apart even now. He had spent months overlooking her, treating her as simply a reliable presence in his office, someone whose competence he took for granted. But tonight, watching her sit quietly beside him, trying to process the fact that her entire world had shifted in the span of a single phone call, Damien realized that Elena Marchetti was far stronger than he had ever given her credit for. And somewhere in the city, someone had made a dangerous mistake by underestimating her too. The car disappeared into the night, carrying both of them toward an uncertain future neither one of them could have predicted just hours earlier, while behind them, the empty street held onto its secrets, waiting for whatever would come next. Neither of them noticed the figure standing in the shadow of a doorway 2 buildings down, watching the car until its taillights vanished around the corner. The figure lifted a phone, typed a short message, and slipped back into the darkness, already planning the next move in a game that Elena did not yet know she was playing, and that Damien was only beginning to understand had far higher stakes than a single missing shipment. The car sped through empty streets, while Elena sat rigid beside Damien, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing faster than the tires beneath them. She had worked for Damien Volkov for 3 years, filing his papers, managing his schedule, watching powerful men come and go from his office, with a mixture of fear and respect in their eyes. She had always known, on some level, that his world was dangerous. She had heard the whispers, seen the way people lowered their voices when they mentioned certain names, noticed the security that surrounded him wherever he went. But knowing something in theory and living it at 2 in the morning were 2 very different things. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence that had settled over the car since they left her apartment. "My estate," Damien answered, his eyes fixed on the passing streets. "You'll be safe there. No one gets in without my permission." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could take care of herself, that she didn't need to be swept away from her home in the middle of the night like something fragile that needed protecting. But the memory of those two cars parked outside her building, of the man who had stepped out with his face half hidden, silenced whatever protest she might have made. She was not foolish enough to pretend she understood the danger she was in, and pretending otherwise would only put both of them at greater risk. She thought of her small apartment, the plants on her windowsill that no one would remember to water, the stack of mail that would pile up outside her door until neighbors began to wonder where she had gone. Her life, small and orderly as it was, suddenly felt very far away, replaced by a reality she had never asked for and did not fully understand. "For how long?" she asked instead. Damien glanced at her, and for a moment, something flickered across his face that looked almost like guilt. "Until I find out who sent those men and why they think you're a threat." The estate came into view a few minutes later, a large stone building set behind iron gates and tall hedges that blocked most of it from view. Elena had never been here before. In 3 years of working for Damien, she had only ever seen the inside of his office, never the world he retreated to when the business day ended. The gates opened automatically as the car approached, and she felt a strange mixture of awe and unease as they drove up the long path toward the entrance. Inside, the house was quiet, lit only by a few soft lamps that cast long shadows across the marble floors. Damien led her through a wide hallway, past rooms she couldn't fully see in the dim light, until they reached a private wing near the back of the house. She noticed details she hadn't expected from a man like him. A grand piano sat untouched in one of the sitting rooms they passed, its surface polished but clearly unused. Framed photographs lined a hallway wall, though most of them showed buildings and skylines rather than people, as if Damien had built a home full of beautiful things but few personal connections to fill it with warmth. It struck her as lonely in a way she hadn't expected, this vast, quiet house that belonged to a man everyone feared, but few, if any, truly knew. "This will be your room," he said, opening a door to reveal a spacious bedroom with its own small sitting area. "There's a bathroom through that door, and if you need anything, my staff will be nearby." Elena stepped inside, taking in the unfamiliar space, feeling suddenly exhausted now that the adrenaline of the night was beginning to fade. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming to get me. You didn't have to do that yourself." Damien stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I did." He said it simply, without explanation, and Elena found herself studying his face, trying to understand the weight behind those two words. Before she could ask what he meant, he stepped back and pulled the door partially closed. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll talk more in the morning." Elena didn't sleep much that night. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening over and over in her mind. The men outside her building. The fear in Damien's eyes when he asked her what she had overheard. The way he had knelt beside her, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, as if he was genuinely afraid for her safety. She had always thought of Damien Volkov as a distant figure, powerful and unreadable, someone she worked for but never truly knew. Tonight had cracked that image, revealing glimpses of a man who felt guilt, who worried, who had personally driven across the city in the middle of the night because he refused to let anything happen to her. It confused her more than she wanted to admit. By the time morning light filtered through the curtains, Elena had barely slept at all. She dressed in the spare clothes that had been left for her, courtesy of Damien's staff, and made her way downstairs, following the sound of quiet movement toward what she assumed was the kitchen. She found Damien sitting at a long table, a cup of coffee in front of him, papers spread across the surface, though he wasn't reading them. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression softened. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you, from the look of things," Elena replied, gesturing toward the untouched coffee that had clearly gone cold. A faint, tired smile crossed his face. Fair enough. She took a seat across from him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt different from the silence they usually shared in the office, less professional, more uncertain. filled with questions neither of them seemed ready to ask. "I need you to tell me everything you remember," Damien finally said, his tone shifting back into something more focused. "About that night, about the phone call you overheard. Every detail matters, even the ones that seem unimportant." Elena took a slow breath, trying to piece together the fragments of memory from 2 nights earlier. "I was filing reports in the room next to your office. Your door wasn't fully closed, and I heard you talking about a shipment, something about a route that had been changed without your knowledge. You mentioned a name, but I couldn't hear it clearly. And you said something about someone inside the company feeding information to people who shouldn't have it." Damien's jaw tightened. "That's everything?" "I think so. I didn't stay to listen longer. I finished my work and went home." She hesitated, then added, "I didn't think it was any of my business. I still don't understand why anyone would think I was a threat over something I barely heard." Damien leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Because whoever is responsible doesn't know how much you heard. To them, even a fragment of that conversation is dangerous. They can't afford to assume you know nothing." Elena felt a chill run through her at the thought, the realization that her safety now depended entirely on the assumptions of someone she had never met, someone hidden within an organization she barely understood. So what happens now? "I can't just hide here forever." "No," Damien agreed, "but you'll stay here until I find out who did this. I have people looking into every possibility, cross-referencing who had access to that shipment's route, who could have known you were working late that night. It's only a matter of time before we identify them." Elena studied him for a long moment, noticing the way his hands rested tensely on the table, the way his eyes carried a weight she hadn't seen in him before, not even during the most stressful negotiations she had witnessed from a distance. "You blame yourself for this," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Damien didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more honest than she had ever heard it. "You've worked for me for 3 years. You've kept my life organized, kept my business running smoothly, and I never once considered what that proximity might cost you. I should have been more careful about what happened behind closed doors. This is my failure, not yours." Something about his honesty caught Elena off guard. She had expected excuses, or perhaps cold detachment, the kind of response she imagined a man like him might give to a problem he considered beneath his attention. Instead, he offered something that felt startlingly close to vulnerability. "You couldn't have known someone was listening," she said. "None of this is your fault." "Maybe not," Damien said, "but it's still my responsibility to fix it." By the second day, Elena had memorized the layout of the private wing, the creak of the 3rd floorboard outside her room, the pattern of footsteps that told her which guard was walking the perimeter and when. Small details, but they gave her a sense of control in a situation where almost everything else had been taken out of her hands. Over the following days, Elena settled into an uneasy rhythm within the walls of the estate. She was not permitted to leave without an escort, a restriction that frustrated her at first, though she gradually came to understand the necessity of it. Damien's men patrolled the grounds constantly, and even within the safety of the house, there was a palpable sense of vigilance that never seemed to fade. She spent her mornings in the small library near her room, reading through books she found on the shelves, and her afternoons occasionally crossing paths with Damien in the kitchen or the long hallway that connected the private wing to the rest of the house. Their conversations grew slightly longer each time, no longer confined to the clipped, professional exchanges they had shared in the office. Elena found herself learning small things about him, the way he took his coffee black without sugar, the way he rubbed his temple when he was thinking through a difficult problem, the way his guarded expression occasionally slipped to reveal something more human underneath. In turn, Damien found himself watching her more closely than he intended, noticing the quiet strength she carried, even in an unfamiliar and dangerous situation, the way she refused to let fear turn her into someone smaller than she was. She asked intelligent questions about the investigation, offered observations about office dynamics that Damien himself had overlooked, and slowly, without either of them fully acknowledging it, she became more than just a secretary caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. One afternoon, she pointed out something that had escaped even Marco's attention. A small inconsistency in the shipment schedule that only someone who had spent years organizing Damien's paperwork would have noticed. Damien sat back in his chair, studying her with new appreciation. "How did you catch that?" he asked. "My best people looked at those records for 2 days." Elena shrugged, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time since she had arrived at the estate. "Your best people weren't the ones filing the paperwork every week. I know what those numbers are supposed to look like. This didn't look right." Damien said nothing for a long moment, simply watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're wasted answering phones," he finally said. "I've always thought so," Elena replied, and for the first time since the night the men appeared outside her building, she allowed herself to laugh, soft and brief, but genuine. Damien found himself smiling in return, a rare and unguarded expression that transformed his face into something younger, something less burdened by the weight of the world he carried on his shoulders every day. It was a small moment, barely worth noticing on its own, but it marked a shift between them, a crack in the careful distance they had both maintained for 3 years, one neither of them was entirely sure how to close again, or whether they even wanted to. One evening, nearly a week after the incident outside her apartment, Marco arrived at the estate with urgent news, interrupting a quiet dinner that Damien and Elena had been sharing in near silence. "Boss, we found something," Marco said, his expression tense as he entered the dining room. "The shipment records. Someone accessed them the night before they went missing, using credentials that shouldn't have had that kind of clearance." Damien stood immediately, his earlier calm replaced by sharp focus. "Whose credentials?" Marco hesitated, glancing briefly at Elena before answering. "That's the problem, boss. The access logs point toward someone close to you, someone who's been with the organization for years." Elena watched the color drain slightly from Damien's face, watched the way his hands curled into fists at his sides, and understood immediately that whatever name Marco was about to say would change everything. "Say it," Damien said, his voice deadly quiet. Marco took a slow breath. "The logs point to Gerald Finch." The name hung in the air like a blade. Elena had met Gerald only a handful of times, a soft-spoken man who managed logistics for Damien's operation, someone who had always seemed unremarkable, forgettable even, blending into the background of every meeting he attended. She would never have suspected him of anything, and from the stunned silence that settled over Damien, neither had he. "That's not possible," Damien said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Gerald has worked for me for 8 years. He has no reason to betray me." "The logs don't lie, boss," Marco said carefully. "Someone used his credentials that night. Whether it was him directly or someone working through him, we don't know yet. But it's the first solid lead we have." Damien turned toward the window, his back to both of them, his shoulders tense with barely contained fury. Elena watched him carefully, seeing the way betrayal settled over him like a physical weight, understanding that this discovery cut deeper than simple business concerns. Trust, once broken by someone close, left wounds that never fully closed. "Bring him in," Damien finally said, his voice cold and controlled once more. Quietly, "I want to speak with him myself before anyone else does." Marco nodded and left the room without another word, the weight of the coming confrontation settling over the house like a storm gathering on the horizon. Elena rose slowly from her seat, unsure whether to offer comfort or give him space, torn between the instinct to reach out and the awareness that this was not her world to navigate so easily. "Damien," she said softly, using his first name for the first time since she had known him. He turned to face her, and for a brief moment, the mask of controlled fury slipped, revealing something raw and uncertain underneath. "I trusted him," he said quietly. "I trusted him with everything, and he may have put your life in danger because of whatever he was hiding." "You don't know that for certain yet," Elena said, stepping closer. Maybe there's an explanation. Maybe someone else used his credentials without his knowledge. Maybe, Damien said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. But either way, I intend to find out exactly what happened, and whoever is responsible will answer for putting you in danger. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the chill of the evening settle over the room despite its warmth. What if he denies it? What if there's no proof beyond a set of credentials that could have been stolen or copied by someone else entirely? Then I'll find proof, Damien said simply. I did not build what I have by accepting easy answers, and I will not start now, not when your safety depends on getting this right. There was something in the certainty of his voice that steadied her, even as the situation around them grew more uncertain by the hour. She had spent 3 years watching him command rooms full of powerful men with nothing more than a calm, measured tone, and she understood now, more clearly than ever, exactly how he had built an empire that so many feared and few dared to challenge. Elena studied his face, seeing the fierce protectiveness burning behind his eyes, and felt something shift inside her chest, an unfamiliar warmth mixed with a growing unease. She had come to this house as a frightened woman, fleeing an unknown threat. She was beginning to leave that fear behind, replaced slowly by something far more complicated, something that had nothing to do with danger, and everything to do with the man standing in front of her, a man the world saw as ruthless and untouchable, but who she now understood carried burdens far heavier than anyone realized. Outside, the night settled over the estate, quiet and still, though both of them understood that the calm would not last much longer. Somewhere within Damien's own organization, a traitor waited, unaware that his carefully hidden betrayal was about to be exposed, and unaware of just how far Damien Volkov was willing to go to protect the woman who had unknowingly become the center of it all. Gerald Finch arrived at the estate 2 hours later, escorted by 2 of Damien's men, his face pale and his hands trembling as he was led into the study where Damien waited alone. Elena watched from the hallway, unable to see through the closed door but close enough to hear the tension in the muffled voices inside. She had never seen Gerald outside the ordinary context of the office, a quiet man who kept to himself, always polite, always efficient, never drawing attention to himself in any way that would suggest he was capable of betrayal. It was hard to reconcile that image with the accusation now hanging over him. Marco stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the door with the same tense focus. Boss doesn't usually handle things like this personally, he said quietly. He must really want answers. Elena glanced at him, curious despite the tension of the moment. Does he usually let someone else handle these situations? Always, Marco said. He trusts his people to manage most problems without his direct involvement. The fact that he's in there himself, asking the questions personally, tells you how seriously he's taking this. Marco paused, studying her for a moment before adding, It tells you how seriously he's taking you too. Elena didn't know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, though the words settled somewhere in her chest and refused to leave. What happens if Gerald is guilty? Elena asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Marco didn't respond right away. Boss will make sure it doesn't happen again, he finally said, his tone carefully neutral, and Elena understood that some things were better left unspoken. Inside the study, Damien sat across from Gerald, his expression carved from stone, giving nothing away. Gerald sat rigid in his chair, sweat beading on his forehead despite the coolness of the room. I don't understand why I'm here, Gerald said, his voice shaking slightly. If this is about the missing shipment, I've already told your men everything I know. Have you? Damien's voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he had shouted. Because my people found something interesting. Your credentials were used to access the shipment records the night before everything disappeared. I'd like you to explain that to me. Gerald's face went white. That's impossible. I was home that night. My wife can confirm it. Someone must have used my login without my knowledge. That's certainly possible, Damien said, leaning forward slightly. Tell me, Gerald, Who else has access to your credentials? Who else knows your passwords, your login information, anything that could allow someone to impersonate you within our systems? Gerald hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door, as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. I don't know. I'm careful with that information. I don't share it with anyone. Then how do you explain what happened? I can't, Gerald admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I swear to you, I had nothing to do with this. I've worked for you for 8 years. Why would I risk everything now? Damien studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deception in his expression, any flicker that might reveal the truth beneath his protests. But all he found was genuine fear, the kind that came from a man who understood exactly what accusations like this could mean for someone in their world. I believe you, Damien finally said, and Gerald's shoulders sagged with visible relief. But someone used your access to steal that shipment, and that same person may have sent men to threaten an innocent woman because they believed she knew too much. I need you to think very carefully about anyone who might have had the opportunity to copy your credentials, anyone who has been near your computer, your office, your home. Gerald sat in silence for a long moment, clearly running through possibilities in his mind. There's one person, he finally said slowly. A new hire, brought on about 2 months ago to help with logistics coordination. He's been shadowing me, learning the systems. I never thought to question his access, since I was the one who trained him. Name, Damien said sharply. Victor Lang, Gerald replied. He came highly recommended, references from a company we've worked with before. I had no reason to doubt him. Damien's expression darkened, though his voice remained level. Where is he now? I don't know. He didn't come into the office yesterday. Said he wasn't feeling well. Gerald's eyes widened as the implications settled over him. You think he's the one who used my credentials? I think it's worth finding out, Damien said, already standing from his chair. Marco will make sure you get home safely. And Gerald, I apologize for the alarm this has caused you. You've been a loyal employee for years, and that hasn't gone unnoticed. Gerald nodded, still visibly shaken, and allowed himself to be led out of the study by one of Damien's men. As he passed Elena in the hallway, he offered her a brief, uncertain glance, as if trying to understand why she had been present for a conversation that clearly involved her safety in some way he didn't fully grasp. Elena felt a small pang of sympathy for him. Whatever else was true, Gerald had walked into that study believing he might be blamed for something he never did, and the fear on his face as he left told her that the accusation, even disproven, would follow him for a long time. She understood, in a way she hadn't fully appreciated before tonight, how quickly trust could be questioned in a world where loyalty was the only currency that truly mattered. Once Gerald had left, Damien emerged from the study, his expression grim. Victor Lang, he said, addressing Marco directly. New hire, 2 months, brought on to help Gerald with logistics. I want everything you can find on him within the hour. Marco nodded and moved quickly toward the front of the house, already pulling out his phone to coordinate the search. Elena remained where she stood, watching Damien carefully as he processed this new information. You don't think Gerald was involved at all, she said. No, Damien said. Gerald has spent 8 years building trust with me. Men like him don't risk everything for a payoff that would only end badly for them. But someone new, someone brought in specifically to learn the systems Gerald manages, someone who then conveniently disappears the day after a shipment goes missing and threats are made against you. That's not a coincidence. Elena felt a chill settle over her as the pieces began falling into place. So this Victor person has been planning this for months, working his way into a position where he could access sensitive information without anyone questioning him. It would seem that way, Damien said, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. And if he's the one behind this, then he knows exactly how much you overheard, which means he'll do everything he can to make sure you never have the chance to identify him. Damien moved to the window of the study, staring out at the dark grounds beyond the glass, his reflection faint against the black night. 2 months, he said quietly, almost to himself. 2 months of careful patience, learning our systems, earning Gerald's trust, all so he could walk away with information valuable enough to justify that kind of investment. Whoever is paying him wanted this badly. What could be worth that much planning? Elena asked. I don't know yet, Damien admitted, but I intend to find out before he has the chance to disappear completely. The rest of the evening passed in tense anticipation as Marco's search for information on Victor Lang began yielding results. Elena stayed close to Damien, unwilling to retreat to her room while so much uncertainty hung over the house. They sat together in the study, papers spread across the desk between them, as Marco periodically returned with updates. The references Gerald mentioned don't check out, Marco reported an hour later. The company he claimed to work for before joining us has no record of him. Whoever vetted his background either made a serious mistake or was deliberately misled. Or paid off, Damien said darkly. Keep digging. I want to know everything about this man, where he lives, who he associates with, anything that might tell us who he's really working for. Marco nodded and left the room again, leaving Damien and Elena alone amid the scattered papers and the low hum of tension that had settled over the entire house. Elena watched him pace slowly along the length of the desk, his mind clearly working through possibilities she couldn't begin to guess at, years of experience allowing him to see patterns and threats that remained invisible to her. You've done this before, she said. Handled situations like this. I mean, more times than I'd like to admit, Damien replied without stopping his pacing. But never quite like this. What's different this time? He finally stopped, turning to look at her directly, something unguarded flickering across his expression before he caught himself. This time it's personal. As the night wore on, Elena found herself growing tired despite the tension still coursing through the house. She excused herself briefly to make tea in the kitchen, needing a moment away from the mounting pressure of the investigation. Damien found her there sometime later, standing by the window, staring out at the dark grounds beyond the glass. You should be resting, he said, joining her by the window. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't come that night, Elena admitted quietly. If Marco hadn't noticed those men outside my building. Damien was quiet for a moment. I try not to think about that. Elena turned to look at him, studying the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion barely hidden beneath his composed exterior. This isn't your fault, Damien. Whatever Victor Lang planned, however long he's been planning it, none of that is something you could have predicted. Maybe not, Damien said, but you're in danger because of my world, because of choices I made long before you ever worked for me. That's a weight I have to carry, whether it's fair or not. There was a rawness to his voice that surprised her, a vulnerability she hadn't expected from a man who commanded such fear and respect from everyone around him. Without fully thinking it through, Elena reached out and placed her hand gently over his where it rested on the counter. You came for me, she said softly. In the middle of the night, without hesitation. Whatever else happens, I won't forget that. Damien looked down at her hand covering his, then back up at her face, something shifting behind his eyes, something neither of them had acknowledged out loud until this moment. The air between them felt charged, heavy with words neither of them had said, questions neither of them had asked. Before either could speak further, Marco's voice echoed from the hallway, urgent and sharp. Boss, we have a problem. Security just flagged movement near the east fence line. The moment shattered instantly, replaced by immediate alertness as Damien straightened, his hand slipping from beneath Elena's as he moved toward the door. How many? Unclear yet, but it doesn't look like an accident, Marco said, already moving toward the security room. Whoever it is, they're not trying very hard to stay hidden. Damien turned back to Elena, his expression hardening into the focused calm she had witnessed the night he came for her. Stay inside. Lock the door behind me, and don't open it for anyone except Marco or myself. Damien. Please, he said, and the simple sincerity in his voice stopped whatever protest she had been about to make. I need to know you're safe while I handle this. Now, Elena nodded. watching him disappear down the hallway with a handful of his men falling into step behind him. The house suddenly filled with a tense, coordinated urgency that reminded her once again of exactly how dangerous the world around her had become. She retreated to the small sitting room near her bedroom, locking the door as instructed, her heart pounding as she strained to hear any sound from outside. The house, which had felt so quiet and controlled only minutes earlier, now seemed to hum with distant movement, doors opening and closing somewhere below, low voices carrying faintly through the walls, the occasional sound of footsteps crossing the gravel path outside her window. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window, careful not to be seen, and peered out at the darkened grounds. She could make out shapes moving near the tree line at the edge of the property, flashlights sweeping in careful, coordinated patterns. It looked less like panic and more like practiced routine, men who had clearly done this before, who understood exactly how to search a property without giving away their own positions. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, though her phone told her only 20 minutes had passed since Damien left. She thought about Victor Lang, about the calculated way he had infiltrated Gerald's trust, about the ruthlessness required to threaten an innocent woman simply because she might have overheard too much. Whoever he was working for, whoever wanted this shipment badly enough to plant a spy inside Damien's organization for months, they were clearly not finished. The movement at the fence line was proof enough of that. This was no longer simply about a missing shipment or stolen information. This had become a direct confrontation, and Elena, despite never asking to be part of any of it, now found herself squarely at the center. When the sound of footsteps finally approached her door nearly an hour later, she tensed, uncertain whether to feel relief or fresh fear, until Damien's voice called softly through the wood. "It's me. You're safe." She opened the door to find him slightly disheveled, a small cut above his eyebrow that hadn't been there before, but otherwise unharmed. Relief flooded through her so suddenly that she nearly reached for him before catching herself, her hand hovering awkwardly in the space between them. "What happened?" she asked instead. "Someone was testing our defenses," Damien said grimly. "Scouting the property, probably trying to determine how heavily guarded you are. They retreated before we could catch them, but it confirms what we suspected. Whoever sent those men to your apartment isn't finished, and now they know exactly where you're being kept." Elena felt the weight of that realization settle heavily in her chest. The estate that had felt like safety only hours earlier now felt like the eye of a storm, temporary shelter in a conflict that was only beginning to intensify. "What do we do now?" she asked. Damien's eyes met hers, steady and resolute, despite the exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "Now we find Victor Lang before he finds a way to reach you again. And we make sure that whoever he's working for understands exactly what happens to people who threaten what belongs to me." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them acknowledged, carrying an implication neither was ready to name aloud. But as Elena studied the fierce determination in Damien's expression, she understood, with sudden and startling clarity, that she had become far more to him than simply an employee under his protection, and that realization terrified her almost as much as the danger still circling outside the estate's walls. Later that night, long after the house had settled back into an uneasy quiet, Elena lay awake listening to the faint sound of Damien's voice through the walls, still coordinating with his men, still working to piece together the identity of the man who had turned her life upside down in the span of a single week. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the kitchen, the warmth of his hand beneath hers, and wondered how a man capable of such quiet gentleness could also command the kind of fear that made grown men tremble in his presence. Perhaps, she thought, as sleep finally began to pull at her, those two things were not as separate as she once believed. Perhaps the same intensity that made him dangerous to his enemies was the very thing that made him so fiercely protective of the people he chose to care about. It was a thought she carried with her into an uneasy sleep, one filled with half-formed dreams of shadows at the fence line and the steady, unwavering sound of Damien's voice promising that she was safe. By morning, Marco had gathered enough information to paint a troubling picture of Victor Lang, one that confirmed Damien's worst suspicions about the scope of the threat facing Elena. He's not just some low-level operator, Marco said, spreading a series of documents across the study desk. Victor has connections to a rival organization, one that's been trying to expand into our territory for the better part of a year. They've been quietly buying influence, recruiting people willing to switch sides, and it looks like Victor was placed inside our operation, specifically to gather intelligence on our shipping routes. Damien studied the documents carefully, his expression darkening with each new detail. Whose organization? Nikolai Petrov, Marco said, and Damien's jaw tightened at the name. He's been trying to muscle into our supply chains for months, but nothing this direct, nothing that involved planting a spy this deep. Elena, seated across the room, watched the exchange with growing unease. She had heard the name Petrov mentioned in passing before, always spoken with a note of caution, always associated with tension that ran deeper than typical business rivalry. Who is he? She asked. I mean, what makes him different from any other competitor? Damien looked up at her, his expression grim. Petrov doesn't play by the same rules the rest of us follow. He's ambitious, ruthless, and he doesn't care who gets hurt, as long as he gets what he wants. If he's the one behind Victor's placement, then this isn't just about a shipment anymore. This is about him trying to gain leverage over my entire operation. Elena sat back in her chair, absorbing the weight of this new information. She had spent her career staying carefully out of the way of the more dangerous aspects of Damien's business, keeping her focus on schedules and paperwork, never once imagining she might become a pawn in a conflict between rival organizations. How long has this rivalry been going on? She asked. Longer than I'd like, Damien said, his voice tight. Petrov has been trying to expand for years, but he's always been careful, always stayed just within the boundaries that kept us from open conflict. This is different. Planting a spy this deep, threatening someone connected to me directly, that's a declaration he's never made before. Which means he's confident, Marco added grimly. Confident enough to risk direct confrontation. That should worry us more than anything else in these files. And I became part of that leverage the moment Victor realized I might know something, Elena said quietly, the pieces falling into place with unsettling clarity. Yes, Damien admitted, which means we need to find him before he decides you're too dangerous to leave alive. The words landed heavily in the room, and Elena felt a fresh wave of fear settle over her, different from the uncertainty of the past week, sharper and more immediate now that she understood the true scale of the danger surrounding her. Damien moved to stand behind his desk, his hands braced against its surface as he stared down at the scattered documents without truly seeing them. I've spent years keeping this world away from the people I care about, he said quietly, more to himself than to Elena. Now Petrov has found a way to reach directly into my home, through you, and I don't intend to let that stand unanswered. Elena watched the resolve harden across his features and felt, despite the fear coiling in her stomach, a strange and unexpected sense of steadiness. Whatever came next, she understood that Damien would not simply wait for danger to arrive. He would meet it head-on, the same way he had met every challenge that had ever threatened what belonged to him. Over the following 2 days, the search for Victor Lang intensified. Damien's men scoured the city, following every lead, questioning contacts within Petrov's known network, tracking financial transactions that might reveal Victor's current location. Elena, unable to simply wait passively while her fate hung in the balance, threw herself into helping however she could, poring over shipping records and personnel files, searching for any detail that might have been overlooked. It was during one of these long sessions, late in the evening with the study lit only by a single desk lamp, that Elena noticed something that made her sit up straight, her pulse quickening. Damien, she said, pulling him away from a conversation with Marco. Look at this. Victor's personnel file lists his previous employer as a logistics company in the Northern District. But look at the dates. According to this, he was working there during the exact same period he claimed to be traveling abroad in his interview notes. Damien leaned over her shoulder, studying the documents she had spread across the desk, and his eyes narrowed as he traced the discrepancy she had found. "You're right. Someone falsified this timeline, and whoever reviewed his application either missed it entirely or was paid to overlook it." "There's more," Elena continued, pulling out another document. "This logistics company, the one he supposedly worked for, I recognize the address. It's registered to a shell company that shows up twice in the financial records for the missing shipment. Whoever set this up wasn't just planting Victor inside our organization. They were laundering money through a company that Victor himself used as a false reference." Marco leaned in, studying the papers with newfound respect. "That's a solid connection. If we can trace that shell company back to its owners, we might be able to pin down exactly where Victor is hiding." He gathered the documents carefully, already planning the next steps aloud as he moved toward the door. "I'll get our contact in financial records to start pulling ownership history tonight. If this shell company has been used more than once, there might be a pattern we can follow. Other properties, other transactions that lead us closer to Petrov's operation." "Keep me updated the moment you have anything," Damien said, and Marco nodded before disappearing down the hallway, leaving Damien and Elena alone once again amid the quiet hum of the desk lamp and the distant sound of the house settling around them. Damien looked at Elena, something like admiration mixing with the tension still evident in his expression. "How did you catch this? My people have been through these files a dozen times." "Because your people were looking for evidence of theft," Elena said. "I was looking for inconsistencies, the kind of small details that don't add up when you're used to organizing paperwork every single day. This is exactly the kind of mistake that gets buried in a stack of routine documents unless someone happens to be looking for exactly this." Damien's expression softened, and for a moment, the weight of the investigation seemed to lift slightly from his shoulders. "You continue to surprise me, Elena Marchetti." "I could say the same about you," she replied, and the warmth in her voice made something shift in his chest, something he had been carefully avoiding acknowledging since the night he first showed up outside her apartment. Marco cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "I'll get this shell company traced immediately. If we're lucky, we'll have a location by morning." As Marco left to begin the trace, Damien remained standing beside Elena, neither of them quite ready to return to the pile of documents still waiting on the desk. "You didn't have to get involved in all this," he said quietly. "You could have stayed in your room, waited for this to resolve itself without putting yourself further into the middle of it." "I couldn't just sit and wait," Elena said. "Not while my life is the reason all of this is happening. I needed to do something, even if it was just reading through old files." "It wasn't just reading through old files," Damien said. "You found something my entire team missed. That kind of instinct isn't something everyone has." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks under the intensity of his gaze, unused to this kind of direct attention from a man who had spent 3 years barely acknowledging her presence beyond professional necessity. "I suppose you never really knew what I was capable of," she said, trying to keep her tone light despite the charged atmosphere between them. "I think a part of me always suspected there was more to you than the version I let myself see," Damien admitted. "It was easier to keep things simple. Employer and employee, nothing more complicated than that. But watching you these past few days, watching how you refuse to be intimidated by any of this, how you keep finding solutions when everyone else is stuck, I can't pretend that simplicity still exists between us." Elena's breath caught slightly at the honesty in his words. In 3 years, she had never once heard him speak so openly, so without the careful control he wore like armor in every business dealing she had witnessed. "I never expected any of this either," she admitted. "I thought I knew exactly what kind of relationship we had. Boss and secretary, professional and distant. I never imagined I'd end up here, in your home, learning things about you that most people never get to see." "Does that frighten you?" Damien asked quietly. "A little," Elena admitted. "But not as much as it probably should." "No," Damien admitted. "I didn't. And that's a mistake I don't intend to keep making. The air between them grew heavier, charged with something neither of them had fully named, though both understood exactly what it meant. Damien took a step closer, his hand reaching up to gently brush a strand of hair away from her face, the gesture so tender it caught Elena completely off guard. "Damien, I know this isn't the time," he said quietly, his hand lingering near her cheek. "I know we have more urgent things to worry about, but I need you to know that whatever happens with Victor, with Petrov, with all of this, none of it changes what I've come to feel over the past week." Elena's heart raced as she looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation and finding none. "What do you feel?" she asked softly. "That I should have seen you long before any of this happened," Damien said. "That the danger surrounding you now doesn't erase the fact that you're the most remarkable person I've had in my life in longer than I can remember." Before Elena could respond, the study door burst open, and one of Damien's men rushed in, his expression urgent. "Boss, we have a problem. Gerald Finch just called. Someone broke into his home an hour ago. He wasn't hurt, but they clearly went through his files, took his laptop, anything connected to the shipment records." Damien's expression hardened instantly, the tender moment between them shattered by the sudden return of danger. "Victor," he said, already moving toward the door. "He's covering his tracks, making sure Gerald can't provide any more evidence against him." "That means he knows we're closing in," Elena said, following close behind. "He's getting desperate." "Desperate men make mistakes," Damien said, though his voice carried a note of caution. "But they also become more dangerous when they feel cornered. We need to move faster than he expects." Within the hour, Marco returned with news that the shell company trace had yielded a location, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city that had been used for questionable transactions over the past several months. Damien assembled his men quickly, the house filling with the same tense, coordinated energy Elena had witnessed the night of the fence line incident. "I'm coming with you," Elena said firmly, as Damien prepared to leave. "Absolutely not," Damien replied without hesitation. "It's too dangerous. You're staying here, protected, while we handle this." "Damien, I found the connection that led you to this location. I might notice something your men would overlook, some detail in the paperwork or the setup that could matter. And if something happens to you, all of this becomes meaningless," Damien said, his voice sharp with barely controlled fear. "I won't risk that. Not after everything we've been through this week." Elena wanted to argue further, but the raw urgency in his expression stopped her. She understood, in that moment, exactly how much this had become about more than protecting a witness to an overheard conversation. This had become deeply, undeniably personal for both of them. "Be careful," she said instead, reaching out to grip his hand tightly. "Please." Damien squeezed her hand in return, something fierce and determined settling into his expression. "I intend to end this tonight," he said. "And then we can finally talk about everything else, without the shadow of Victor Lang hanging over us." He left with Marco and a dozen of his most trusted men, the house falling into an anxious silence once the sound of their vehicles faded into the distance. Elena stood at the window of the study, watching the last set of headlights disappear down the long drive, feeling more alone in that vast, quiet house than she had at any point since Damien first brought her here. The staff who remained moved carefully through the halls, speaking in low voices, checking locks and windows with a diligence that only heightened her sense of unease. She tried to distract herself by returning to the files still scattered across the desk, searching for anything else that might help, but her mind refused to focus, circling back again and again to the image of Damien walking into a warehouse that might be crawling with armed men, loyal to a rival, who clearly had no reservations about violence. She thought about the cut above his eyebrow from the fence line incident, how easily that could have been something far worse, and realized with a jolt just how much she feared losing him now, not simply as someone who had rescued her, but as someone who had become essential to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Elena paced the length of the study, unable to settle, her mind racing through every possible outcome of the confrontation unfolding somewhere across the city. Hours passed with no word, each minute stretching the tension in her chest, tighter and tighter. She thought about Damien's words in the study, the tenderness in his touch, the vulnerability he had allowed himself to show despite the danger surrounding them both. She thought about how quickly everything could be taken away, how fragile this fragile new understanding between them truly was. She thought, too, about Petrov himself, a man she had never met, but who now felt like a looming shadow over everything, someone willing to risk open conflict simply to gain an advantage in a business rivalry. She wondered what kind of man built his ambitions on the willingness to threaten people who had nothing to do with the conflict at all, and found herself hoping, fiercely and without apology, that Damien would make him regret ever setting his sights on either of them. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, then further still, each passing minute stretching the silence in the house into something almost unbearable. Elena finally abandoned the study and moved to the window of her own room, watching the dark tree line at the edge of the property, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of what was happening at the warehouse across the city. She had never felt so powerless, so entirely dependent on news that refused to come, and she understood now, more than ever, the particular agony of loving someone whose world demanded this kind of danger as a matter of course. When her phone finally rang, displaying Marco's name on the screen, Elena answered with trembling hands, bracing herself for whatever news awaited her on the other end of the line. "We found him." Marco's voice came through the phone, tense but steady. "Victor Lang. He's here at the warehouse, along with 3 other men. Looks like they were preparing to move something out tonight. Probably the last of whatever evidence connects him to Petrov." Elena gripped the phone tightly, her heart pounding. "Is Damien all right?" "He's fine. Focused on getting Victor to talk before anything else happens. I wanted you to hear it from me directly, so you wouldn't worry when you didn't hear from him for a while." There was a pause. Then Marco added, "This should be over soon, Elena, one way or another." The call ended, leaving Elena standing alone in the quiet study, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest despite Marco's reassurance. She paced the length of the room, unable to settle, her mind replaying every possible outcome of the confrontation unfolding across the city. Across town, inside the dimly lit warehouse, Damien stood facing Victor Lang, who sat bound to a chair, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the cool night air seeping through the building's broken windows. Marco and several other men stood positioned around the room, weapons visible but lowered, a silent reminder of exactly how outmatched Victor had become. "You've made a costly mistake," Damien said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built his reputation across the city. "Threatening an innocent woman, betraying the trust of a man who never gave you reason to doubt him. Petrov chose poorly when he selected you for this task." Victor's eyes flicked toward the men positioned around the room, searching for any weakness in the formation, any opening that might offer escape. He found none. The warehouse, once a place he had used to move stolen information quietly out of the city, had become a trap of his own making, the walls closing in around choices he could no longer take back. Victor's jaw clenched, defiance flickering behind his fear. "You think this ends with me? Petrov has resources you can't even imagine." "This is just the beginning." "Perhaps," Damien said, stepping closer. "But you're the one sitting in that chair right now, and Petrov isn't here to protect you. So I suggest you consider very carefully how this conversation goes, because the only leverage you have left is whatever information you're willing to share." For a long moment, Victor said nothing, his eyes darting between Damien and the armed men surrounding him, calculating odds that had already tilted irreversibly against him. Finally, his shoulders sagged, the last of his defiance draining away. "Petrov wanted the shipment records," Victor said quietly. "Not just for the money, though that mattered too. He wanted proof of every route, every contact, every deal you've made over the past 3 years. He's planning something bigger, something that would let him take over your operations entirely, not just compete with you." Damien's expression darkened further. And the woman? Why target her specifically? I saw her leaving your office late one night, and I overheard enough to know she might have information about the shipment. Petrov's orders were clear. Eliminate any risk of exposure. I sent men to watch her apartment, to determine how much of a threat she actually posed. I never intended for it to go further than that, not until we understood what she knew. You put her life at risk over an assumption, Damien said coldly. Where is Petrov now? Victor hesitated, and Marco stepped forward, his expression leaving no room for further delay. Victor's resolve broke completely under the weight of the moment. He has a property outside the city, an old estate he uses for meetings he doesn't want traced back to his main operations. That's where he'll be waiting to hear how tonight went. Damien exchanged a look with Marco, both of them understanding immediately what this meant. Petrov had underestimated them, believing Victor's mission would succeed quietly, without any direct confrontation. That miscalculation had just handed Damien exactly the opening he needed. He'll be expecting a report from Victor sometime tonight, Marco said, thinking quickly. If we move fast enough, we can reach him before he realizes anything went wrong here. Good, Damien said. I want him unprepared. I want him to understand exactly how badly he miscalculated before he has the chance to gather his defenses. Secure him, Damien said, gesturing toward Victor. We're not finished with this conversation, but I have somewhere else to be tonight. As Damien's men moved to detain Victor properly, Damien pulled Marco aside, his voice low and urgent. I want a team ready within the hour. If Petrov is expecting news of Elena's death tonight, then I intend to be the one who delivers a very different message. Boss, going after Petrov directly, that's a significant escalation, Marco said carefully. Once you cross that line, there's no going back to the way things were before. He crossed that line the moment he sent someone to threaten Elena, Damien said, his voice hard and final. I'm not interested in half measures anymore. Get the team ready. Back at the estate, Elena's phone rang again, this time displaying Damien's name instead of Marco's. She answered immediately, relief flooding through her at the sound of his voice. Are you safe? She asked, before he could speak. I'm fine, Damien said. We found Victor. He confirmed everything. Petrov's involvement, his plans to use the shipment information against my entire operation. I'm heading to confront him directly tonight, to end this before he has the chance to try anything else. Elena's stomach tightened with fresh fear. Damien, that sounds incredibly dangerous. Please, be careful. I will, he said, his voice softening slightly. Elena, whatever happens tonight, I need you to know that these past few days, getting to know you the way I have, it's changed something in me that I didn't expect to change. I intend to come back and tell you exactly what that means, once this is finally over. The call ended before Elena could respond, leaving her standing in the quiet study with her heart racing, torn between fear for his safety and the warmth of his words settling deep in her chest. Hours passed in agonizing silence. Elena tried to distract herself with the files still scattered across the desk, but her mind refused to focus on anything beyond the uncertainty of what was happening across the city. She thought about Petrov, a man she had never met, but who now held the power to end everything before it had truly begun, and she found herself praying, in whatever way she knew how, that Damien would return to her unharmed. She thought, too, about how quickly her entire understanding of her own life had shifted in the span of a single week. Only days ago, she had been an ordinary woman with an ordinary routine, filing paperwork and organizing schedules, content with the quiet predictability of her days. Now she stood at the center of a conflict between powerful men, waiting through the darkest hours of the night for news that would determine not just her safety, but the shape of whatever future she might have with a man she had barely allowed herself to notice until danger forced her to see him clearly. She wandered through the quiet halls of the estate as the hours dragged on, pausing occasionally by windows that offered a view of the empty grounds, the security lights casting long shadows across the grass. The staff who remained moved carefully around her, offering quiet reassurances that did little to ease the tightness in her chest. She thought about calling Marco for an update, then decided against it, understanding that both of them needed to focus entirely on the task at hand without the added weight of her own anxiety pulling their attention away from what mattered most. It was nearly dawn when she finally heard the sound of vehicles approaching the estate, headlights sweeping across the study windows as the cars pulled up the long driveway. Elena rushed to the front entrance, her heart pounding as she waited for the door to open, uncertain what news awaited her on the other side. When Damien stepped through the entrance, exhaustion evident in every line of his face but otherwise unharmed, Elena felt relief crash over her so completely that she crossed the distance between them without hesitation, wrapping her arms around him tightly. "It's over," Damien said quietly, his arms coming around her in return, holding her close as if he had been waiting all night for exactly this moment. "Petrov has agreed to withdraw entirely from any territory connected to my operations." He understood very clearly that continuing this conflict would cost him far more than he was prepared to lose. Elena pulled back slightly to look up at him, searching his face for the details he wasn't saying aloud. "What happened?" "I made it clear that threatening you was a mistake he would regret for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be," Damien said. "He's not a foolish man, whatever else he is. He understood the message." Elena studied his expression, seeing the exhaustion mixed with quiet resolve, and understood that whatever confrontation had taken place, it had ended the threat against her permanently, without the violence that could have easily consumed the entire night. "Victor?" she asked. "He'll face consequences within my organization, but he won't be a threat to you again," Damien said. "None of this will touch you anymore, Elena. I promise you that." Relief washed over her so completely that she felt tears gathering in her eyes, the accumulated fear and tension of the past week finally beginning to release. Damien reached up, gently brushing a tear from her cheek, his touch tender despite the exhaustion still evident in his own expression. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said softly. "It's finally over." "Thank you," Elena whispered, "for everything. For coming for me that night, for protecting me through all of this, for trusting me enough to let me help find the answers. You made yourself impossible to ignore," Damien said, a faint smile touching his lips despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "I don't think I could go back to seeing you as simply my secretary now, even if I wanted to." Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, a warmth that had nothing to do with relief, and everything to do with the way he was looking at her, steady and unguarded, as if the careful distance he had maintained for 3 years had finally, completely dissolved. "What happens now?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Now," Damien said, reaching up to gently cup her face in his hands, "I finally get to tell you everything I should have said days ago." He paused, studying her face as if memorizing every detail. "Elena Marchetti, somewhere between that phone call at 2 in the morning and tonight, you became the most important person in my life. I don't intend to let that fade away simply because the danger has passed." Elena's breath caught, her heart racing with an entirely different kind of intensity than the fear she had carried for the past week. "I never expected any of this," she admitted. "Not the danger, and certainly not this." "Neither did I," Damien said, "but I've never been more certain of anything." He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, but Elena remained perfectly still, and when their lips finally met, it felt less like a beginning and more like the natural conclusion of everything that had been building quietly between them since the night he refused to let anyone or anything stand between himself and her safety. They stood together at the entrance for a long moment, neither willing to let go, the weight of the entire ordeal finally beginning to lift from their shoulders. Marco and the other men filed past them quietly, giving them space, understanding without needing to be told that something significant had shifted between their boss and the woman he had risked everything to protect. "Come inside," Damien finally said, his voice gentle. "You need rest, and so do I." Elena nodded, allowing him to guide her back into the house, her hand still clasped tightly in his, as if neither of them was quite ready to let go of the physical reassurance that they had both come through the night intact. They settled into the quiet sitting room near the kitchen, and for the first time since the ordeal began, the silence between them felt peaceful rather than tense, filled with the quiet exhaustion of two people who had weathered something difficult together and emerged on the other side. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Elena moved into a role within Damien's organization that reflected her true capabilities, no longer simply managing his schedule, but actively involved in decisions that shaped the direction of his operations. The office that had once treated her as background noise now understood, without needing to be told directly, that Elena Marchetti commanded respect equal to anyone else in the building. Gerald Finch, cleared entirely of any wrongdoing, returned to his position with renewed appreciation for the trust Damien placed in him, grateful that the truth had emerged before any lasting damage was done to his reputation. He made a point, in the weeks that followed, of personally thanking Elena for the discovery that had ultimately proven his innocence, a small gesture that meant more to her than he likely realized. Victor Lang faced the consequences of his betrayal, though the details remained carefully contained within the boundaries of Damien's organization. And Petrov, true to his word, withdrew entirely from any territory connected to Damien's operations, understanding fully the cost of underestimating the woman he had once dismissed as nothing more than an easy target. The office itself transformed in subtle but meaningful ways. Where colleagues had once walked past Elena's desk without a second glance, they now sought her opinion on matters that extended well beyond scheduling and paperwork. Her sharp attention to detail, the very quality that had helped uncover Victor's deception, became recognized as an asset too valuable to remain confined to administrative tasks. Damien made certain of that, publicly acknowledging her contributions in ways that left no room for anyone to question her new standing within the organization. Elena often thought back to that terrifying night when 2 in the morning had brought a phone call that changed everything, when Damien Volkov had left his home without hesitation, driven only by the fierce need to protect someone he had spent months quietly, unknowingly falling for. What began as danger had transformed into something neither of them had expected, a connection built on trust, resilience, and the kind of understanding that only comes from facing the worst together and emerging stronger on the other side. She was no longer invisible, no longer simply the quiet woman who kept the schedules organized and the coffee ready each morning. She had proven herself capable of navigating danger with the same sharp intelligence she brought to every task, and in doing so, she had earned not just Damien's protection, but his complete and unwavering devotion. There were quieter moments, too, in the weeks that followed, ordinary evenings that felt almost strange in their calmness after everything they had endured together. They would sit together in the study, where so much of the investigation had unfolded, Damien reviewing reports while Elena read nearby, the silence between them comfortable now instead of uncertain. Occasionally he would look up and find her watching him, and something warm would pass between them, unspoken but entirely understood, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had come from the careful distance that once defined their days. Marco, too, noticed the change, watching with quiet approval as the man he had served for years allowed himself, for the first time, to build something beyond the walls of business and strategy. He never mentioned it directly, but the ease in his voice whenever he greeted Elena, the respect he now extended to her without hesitation, spoke volumes about how completely she had earned her place within their world. As Elena stood beside him now, watching the sun rise over the city from the balcony of his estate, she understood that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them together, no longer separated by the careful distance of employer and employee, but bound instead by something far stronger, something forged in the fire of danger and proven true in the quiet moments that followed. The city stretched out before them, waking slowly into a new day, And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future felt full of possibility rather than uncertainty. Damien's arms settled around her shoulders, drawing her close as the first light of morning spread across the skyline. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. Elena leaned into him, feeling safer and more certain than she ever had before. "None at all," she said. "Not one."